Okay, so you guys have sent in some really fascinating stuff, all about book cover design, specifically for those business books you're working on. And we're going to take a deep dive into all this information.
Yeah, this should be fun.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so too. I mean, it's something that I think a lot of people just kind of put off to the end, like, oh, yeah, I'll get a cover eventually. But really, it's so important to be thinking about the cover really right from the start because it really is your book's first impression.
Yeah, and it's not just a first impression in a vacuum, right? It's a first impression that has to do a ton of work for you. Like it's
Right.
got to stand out, it's got to communicate what the book is about, it's got to convey your brand. Like
Yeah.
all of that is wrapped up in this one little visual.
So much pressure.
There is.
And one of the things that I really loved from this article that you sent over is this idea that your cover is either pulling people in or it's pushing them away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think sometimes we create covers that we think are really cool or really interesting, but they might actually be pushing our ideal reader away without us even realizing it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think about it, like kind of that force, right? Like, is it a force of attraction or is it a force of repulsion? And we always want to be thinking about that attractive force.
Definitely. And even though we say don't judge a book by its cover, the reality is people do judge a book by its cover.
Yeah, they do.
And I think as marketers and as authors, we need to accept that and actually use that to our advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a world of so much content, right? So many books, so much information coming at us all the time. People need shortcuts to make decisions. And a book cover is like the ultimate shortcut.
Exactly. And it's funny because I think the article mentions that it actually positions this as a good thing for marketers
Mm-hmm.
because it means that we can use this to our advantage if we understand how people are making these snap judgments.
Yeah, exactly. And if you can nail that cover, you're already ahead of the game, right? You've already kind of won half the battle.
And there are three main signals that a cover sends what the book is about, who it's for, and whether the author is worth listening to.
Right. And that's a huge one, right? Like, are you somebody that I want to spend my time with?
Exactly. And it's not just our opinion that this matters. There's actually data to back this up.
Yeah, what was that statistic from the book smugglers survey?
Yeah, so 79% of readers said that cover design influences their decision to click or buy.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's huge.
It really is.
So it's not just a small preference. It really is a major factor in people's buying decisions.
And it makes sense, right? Like we're all busy. We don't have time to read every single book description. So we're relying on those visual cues to help us decide what's worth our time.
Exactly. So let's dive into these three maybe counterintuitive design rules that this material talks about for attracting the right clients with your book cover.
Okay, sounds good.
So the first one is professionalism over personality. And I think this is something that maybe a lot of us struggle with
Mm-hmm. I can see that.
because we want to express ourselves on the cover. We want to show our unique style.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, your book is your baby, right? You put so much of yourself into it.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that the primary purpose of a business book is to really convert, and compel readers.
Right. And unless you are the brand, right? Like unless you're Oprah or Tony Robbins or somebody like that,
Yeah.
where your face is like instantly recognizable and people are buying you as much as they're buying the book.
Right.
For most of us, putting personal elements on the cover, like our photos, our favorite colors, quirky fonts, like that can actually work against us.
Yeah. I think that's a good point because people are buying a result.
Yeah.
They're not buying a piece of art.
Exactly. Yeah. They want to know what's in it for them. How is this book going to help them solve a problem or achieve a goal?
Right. And I think that's a really important distinction to make.
Yeah, it is.
So how do we reflect professionalism while still allowing a little bit of our personality to shine through?
Well, there are a few ways to do that, and this material lays out some really good tips.
Okay.
So one is to choose brand-adjacent colors. So for business nonfiction, that usually means blues, greens, more muted tones,
Okay.
but you can still use your brand colors as accents.
Okay. So not necessarily the main color, but maybe like pops of color.
Exactly. Yeah, like maybe a little bit in the subtitle or a little graphic element or something like that.
Gotcha.
And another really important tip is to study the covers of similar books.
Yeah.
Look at what's working, what's trending, what's catching people's eye in your genre.
Right.
And again, it's not about copying, but it's about making sure that your book looks like it belongs.
Right. It fits in with the expectations.
Exactly. Yeah, you don't want your book to look like a total outlier.
Yeah, because then people are like, what is this?
Yeah, exactly. And then when it comes to fonts, keep it simple.
Okay.
1 or 2 fonts max.
Okay.
And a good rule of thumb is to use a sans serif font for the title and a serif font for the subtitle.
Okay, that makes sense.
But if you want to get a little bit creative with your typography, you can use the subtitle as a place to express your personality.
Okay, so maybe like a more unique phrasing or a slightly bolder font.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good place to kind of let your voice come through.
Gotcha. So it's not about being totally bland and generic. It's about being professional, but still having those little touches that make you stand out.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so moving on to the second rule, which is your reader is the star, not you.
Mhm.
And this one is all about shifting our perspective.
Yeah, it really is like a mindset shift.
Right, because we tend to get really focused on what we want our cover to look like.
Yeah, like what we think looks good, what represents us.
Right. But the most effective covers actually speak to the reader's visual language.
Yeah, they tap into their aspirations, their frustrations, their aesthetic preferences.
Right, and the goal is for the cover to say, this is for you.
Exactly. A little whisper in their ear.
And there's that great anecdote about the book Home Sweet Home page.
Oh, yeah, what was that?
So the author initially had a cover that they really liked. They described it as cutesy,
Oh, okay.
but it actually wasn't resonating with their whole target audience.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah, and they weren't seeing the sales that they were hoping for.
So what happened?
Well, they ended up redesigning the cover to be a little bit more professional, a little bit cleaner,
Okay.
still approachable, but less cutesy, and really focused on the core value proposition of the book.
Okay, and that worked better.
Yeah, much better.
Hmm.
The sales process became much smoother.
Wow. So sometimes our personal taste can actually be a liability.
Yeah, it can. And I think that's a really good reminder to kind of check ourselves and make sure that we're designing for our reader, not for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what are some of the key questions we should be asking ourselves to make sure that our reader is the star of our cover?
Well, the material lays out some really good ones. So the first one is, what does your reader aspire to become in relation to the topic of your book?
Okay.
So what is that aspirational identity that they're looking for? And how can your cover design reflect that?
Okay, so it's about branding the result, not just branding you as the expert.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about showing them what's possible, what they can achieve if they read your book.
Gotcha. Okay, what's the next question?
The next one is, what other books are your readers already buying?
Okay, yeah.
This is huge because it tells you what's already working in the market, what your target audience is already responding to.
Right, it's like they've already given their approval to these covers.
Exactly. Yeah. So study those covers, pay attention to the colors, the fonts, the overall style.
Right, and see what you can learn from them.
Mhm.
Okay, and the third question.
The third question is, what is your reader's aesthetic bias?
Okay, so what kind of style are they drawn to?
Yeah, are they more corporate? Are they more creative? Are they somewhere in between?
Right,
And this is important because you want your cover to feel familiar and appealing to them.
right. It needs to speak their language. Okay, so we've talked about professionalism over personality. We've talked about making the reader the star. Now let's talk about this third rule, which sounds a little bit contradictory.
Okay.
Blend in to stand out.
Yeah, this one always throws people off a little bit.
Right, because usually in marketing, we're told to stand out, to be different, to be unique.
Right, be a purple cow.
Yeah, exactly. But in book cover design, especially for business nonfiction, conformity actually creates trust.
Yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive, but it makes sense when you think about it.
Right, because readers are subconsciously trained to recognize what belongs in their niche.
Mm-hmm.
So when your cover matches those expectations, it signals legitimacy.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like saying, hey, this book is legit. You're in the right place.
Right, and it makes people feel more comfortable, more likely to take a chance on your book.
Yeah, exactly.
But of course, we don't want to blend in so much that we become invisible.
Right.
So that's where the twist comes in.
Okay.
We need to add one subtle disruption to catch the eye without breaking trust.
Okay, so like what kind of disruption are we talking about?
Well, it could be a pop of contrasting color.
Okay.
It could be a bold subtitle. It could be a visual metaphor.
Okay, so something that's unexpected but not totally out there.
Exactly.
Yeah, interesting.
And the newsletter has this great advice about reverse engineering shelf placement.
What does that mean?
So basically, you imagine your book on a shelf next to your competitors,
Okay.
and you can actually use a tool like Canva to create a mock-up of this.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, and then you ask yourself some questions.
What kind of questions?
Does my book look like it belongs in this category? Would a reader instantly understand the promise of the book just from the cover alone? And what's the one thing that my cover does differently?
Okay, that's a good exercise.
Yeah, I think so too. And it really helps you to see your cover through the eyes of your reader.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the newsletter also mentions 3 common elements of great nonfiction book covers.
Okay, what are those?
A familiar color palette, a clear font hierarchy, and a predictable layout.
Okay, so those are kind of like the foundation, and then you add the twist on top.
Right.
Yeah.
So those three elements create trust, and then the twist adds intrigue. Now, let's talk about genre, because genre plays a huge role in cover design.
Yeah, it really does.
Your cover should not only signal what your book is about, but also how the reader should experience it.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, a thought leadership book should have a different feel than a tactical how-to book.
Right, because they're trying to achieve different things.
Exactly. And the cover needs to reflect that.
So what kind of cover would you typically see for a thought leadership book?
Well, you'd often see clean lines, sharp contrast, bold sans serif fonts.
Okay, so kind of like Simon Sinek or Brene Brown.
Exactly. Yeah, those are great examples. And then for a tactical how-to book, you'd probably see a more straightforward layout,
Okay.
a clear hierarchy of titles, maybe some subtle icons.
Okay, so more focused on clarity and ease of use.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And then for a memoir-infused business book, you might see a more balanced approach
Okay.
with imagery that hints at the author's personal journey, but still typography that conveys authority.
So kind of a blend of the personal and the professional. Interesting.
And it's really important to get this right, because if you choose the wrong look for your genre, you're going to attract the wrong readers.
Yeah, you'll end up with people who are expecting something completely different from what your book actually delivers.
Right. And that's never a good thing.
Nope.
Now let's talk about some common mistakes that authors make with their covers.
Okay.
Because these mistakes can really undercut your credibility and your sales.
Yeah, I can see that.
So one of the biggest mistakes is using too many fonts.
Okay. How many is too many?
The newsletter says stick to a maximum of 2.
Okay.
And then another mistake is illegible typography or soft contrast.
Yeah, that's a big one, especially online when people are scrolling through thumbnails.
Right. If they can't read your title, they're not going to click on your book.
Definitely not.
And then another mistake is having a cover that looks like fiction or amateurish.
Yeah, the dreaded Canva on autopilot look.
Exactly.
We've all seen it.
We have, and it just
Yeah.
doesn't convey professionalism or credibility. And then another mistake is ignoring the thumbnail test.
Right, how it looks at that small size on Amazon.
Exactly, because that's how most people are going to see your book initially.
Yeah, so you have to make sure that it stands out and is legible even at that tiny size.
Definitely. Now, the newsletter also mentions this idea of the blink test.
What's that?
So it's basically the idea that your cover should make a good impression in the blink of an eye.
Okay.
Does it look professional? Does it communicate the topic? Does it target the right audience?
Right.
And if it doesn't pass that blink test, you've lost the reader.
Yeah, they've already moved on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the other point that they make is that we need to design for both online thumbnails and physical bookshelves.
Yeah, that's a good point because not everyone buys books online.
Right.
Some people still go to bookstores.
Exactly. So you need a cover that works in both worlds.
Makes sense.
Now let's say you're ready to hire a designer.
Okay.
How do you find a designer who really understands business nonfiction?
Well, that's a good question because not all designers are created equal.
Right.
Some designers are really good at designing for fiction, but they don't really understand the nuances of nonfiction.
Exactly.
So the first thing you want to do is curate a few examples of successful covers from your niche.
Okay.
So show the designer what's already working, like what your target audience is responding to.
Right. So they have a visual reference point.
Exactly.
Okay. What else should you tell your designer?
Well, you should give them a really detailed profile of your ideal reader.
Okay. So not just their demographics, but also their psychographic.
Exactly. Yeah, their values, their aspirations, their pain points.
Right. Because the more the designer understands your reader, the better they can design for them.
Mm-hmm.
And what about your business goals? Should you share those with the designer?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, your cover is part of your overall marketing strategy. So the designer needs to understand what you're trying to achieve with your book.
Right. Do you want to generate leads? Do you want to establish yourself as an expert? Do you want to sell other products or services?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And the designer can use that information to create a cover that supports your goals. Now, the newsletter also mentions that you should share your brand visuals with the designer, but be careful not to let them dictate the design.
Yeah, that's a good point because sometimes your brand guidelines might not be the best fit for a book cover.
Right.
You know, you might need to make some adjustments to appeal to your reader.
Exactly. And there's a bonus tip here that I think is really smart.
What's that?
Ask the designer how they interpret strategy through visual hierarchy.
Okay.
So basically, how do they use visual elements to guide the reader's eye and emphasize key information? And if they can't answer that question, clearly, they might not be the right fit for you.
Yeah. It's a good red flag.
It is, because it shows that they're not really thinking about the cover as a marketing tool.
Right. They're just thinking about it as a pretty picture.
Yeah, exactly. Now, as we wrap up this deep dive, the newsletter has this really great final thought. Your book cover isn't decoration. It's differentiation.
Yeah, that's a powerful statement.
It is, and I think it's so important for us to remember that, because our cover is not just an afterthought.
Right. It's an investment.
It is, and it's one of our most important marketing assets.
Yeah, it's the first thing people see. It's your book salesperson.
Exactly. And when it's designed, well, it can build trust, keep curiosity, and prime the reader to think, yes, this is exactly what I need. So instead of just aiming for a cover that looks nice, we should be aiming for a cover that elicits specific judgments in the mind of our reader.
And what are those judgments?
Smart, professional.
A must-read.
Yeah, those are good ones.
They are. And I think that's a great goal to strive for.
Definitely.
Now, there are also a few FAQs in the newsletter that I thought were really helpful.
Okay, let's hear them.
So the first one is, what makes a book cover client attracting? And the answer is basically that it aligns with your brand and your audience's aspirations, and it clearly communicates value.
Right.
So it's both visually appealing and strategically sound.
Exactly.
Okay, what's the next one?
The next one is, should I use my photo on my cover?
And the answer is generally no, unless you're a well-known personal brand or the book is about you.
Right, because for most business books, your photo is going to be more distracting than helpful.
Yeah, it's not really about you, it's about the reader.
Exactly.
Okay, what else?
How can I test my cover?
Well, you can do the thumbnail test, you can use a polling platform like PickFu, or you can even get feedback from your network on LinkedIn.
Oh, those are good ideas.
Yeah, they are.
And then another question is, can I design my own cover?
And the answer is maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah, but only if you have both design skills and marketing strategy.
Right.
If you don't, it's probably better to hire a professional.
Definitely. And then the last question is, where can I find nonfiction savvy designers?
And the newsletter recommends Readsy 99 Designs and Peer Referral. But the most important thing is to make sure that the designer understands your business goals.
Right, because at the end of the day, your cover is a marketing tool.
Exactly.
So it needs to be designed with that in mind.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think that's a great overview of all the key points from this material.
Yeah, it was really good.
It was, and I love that closing metaphor they used.
Yeah.
Is the handshake. Your title is the opening line. Your message is what makes people stay.
Yeah, that's a good one.
It is, and I think it really sums up everything we've talked about today.
Yeah, like all of those elements need to work together,
Yeah.
create that perfect first impression.
Definitely. And for those of you who want to go even deeper into title and subtitle strategy, the newsletter mentions Karma Spence's videos, specifically book titles that sell, breaking the SEO mold, and rethinking book subtitles. Why SEO isn't the answer.
Oh, those sound interesting.
Yeah, they're really good, and they offer a really smart approach to crafting titles and subtitles that are both client attracting and effective. Because at the end of the day, you don't just want clicks, you want a genuine connection with the readers who need what you offer. And that connection begins on your cover.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with me.
Of course. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, this was a good one.
It was.
All right, we'll see you next time.
See you later.